Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you happenstance into this incredible panel discussion with some of the most prolific experts in all that is befuddling the United States and possibly the world at the moment. We're all in a great deal of shock, but the purpose of this dialogue is to create some clarity and understanding and potentially, hopefully, a pathway forward that if we can connect with millions of people to understand what these people are going to be so generous with their time to reveal, that hopefully we can start to build a critical mass towards a resolution to the problems that we are all in the midst of. So, quick introduction from top left to bottom. At the top left of my screen is June Carbone, the Rabina Chair at the University of Minnesota for Law and Technology and Science. And she is an expert in a lot of all elements of white collar fraud, particularly as it relates to her latest book that I'll put down in our notes that is entitled Fair Shake: Women in the Fight to Build a Just Economy. Directly below June is, of course, David K. Johnston. David K. Johnston is a very well-known and recognized journalist, has been in the game for decades as it relates specifically to all things IRS, and he's an expert in all things taxes, but particularly in Donald Trump. And look forward to a lot of the revelations that David will bring to this dialogue. Directly below him is Paul Pelletier, at the moment a professor at George Washington University, but he was also ran for a representative, I believe, in Virginia. And then prior to that, he served in the Department of Justice for decades, was involved at the highest levels of white collar fraud, and has been so generous with his time and his expertise to reveal the inside realities of some of the mechanisms that have created the problems that we're currently in the midst of. Directly below me is Mark Dan. Mark Dan, former Attorney General of the great state of Ohio, probably one of the most prolific AGs in the country by way of the fact that he discovered the only RICO and indicted and created a conviction of the only RICO conviction of a story that was basically the entirety of our financial system in the aftermath of the great financial crisis. He is currently practicing law for Dan Law, as you can see right behind him, and I'll provide links to his law firm down below as well. And then, of course, the great William K. Black below him, I'd say the quarterback of this group of folks that I followed and depended on because of his great work, specifically as it related to the savings and loan crisis. But he's had a long tenure in criminology, as well as being a professor at the University of Kansas City of Missouri in both law and economics, as well as University of Minnesota. So on that note, I want to open up the conversation because a lot is flying at us. Kash Patel just got approved by the Senate, for obviously being the director of the FBI, and so much more in terms of the things that are flying at us a million times a second. I want to ask you first, Mark. I remember when we talked the last time that you had warned us what was going to happen because we weren't able to root out the corruption of previous administrations that we were, in store for. How are you looking at that given your proclamation? The now.
Well, it's almost like the Trump folks are doing a reverse jujitsu here. They're claiming that using the excuse of the prior administration's failure to root out corruption, and particularly corporate corruption, as a reason for them to put in place people who will on their behalf allow that corruption to go forward very blatantly and openly. But the excuse they're using for it is that the Justice Department has been corrupt all these years and subject to the whims and the influence of the rich folks in the country and of the political leadership and establishment of the country. And that's the reason why they want to have a guy who's totally unqualified and dangerous, like Kash Patel, become the FBI director. That's the rationale they're using. And given the I hate to use the words mainstream media, but the media's determination to do parallel analysis, these crazy thoughts are becoming part of a dialogue, and people are actually considering that as a basis for this insane criminal conspiracy to loot the federal government. I don't know what else. If you were, and I'm interested to see what Bill has to say about this, but if you were going to make a plan to loot the federal government, I think you would include literally everything that the Trump administration has done in the first 4 weeks, starting with creating the meme coins. To create a legal path to bribe both Donald and Melania Trump. That was the day before he took office. To every personnel decision, to going after the inspectors general, to gutting the honest folks in the Justice Department and the FBI, to pardoning the January 6 folks. It's a plan, I'm also interested to hear what David has to say. He knows Donald Trump better than anybody. It seems to me that that's his goal. I mean, that's what they want to do. They want to enrich themselves and their friends at the expense of the rest of us.
I think that it goes without saying that, Bill, it might be a good opportunity for you to start us down that path in response to what Mark queried.
Yes, in criminology, we call it a criminogenic environment. It's just an environment in which the incentives are really perverse. And that basically means, in the case of elite white collar crime, you can steal a lot of money and get away with it. And indeed,
if you're stealing it for the right people, Bill.
Right. Us. It's like La Cosa Nostra. It's our thing, right?
Right.
For us, everything. For everyone else, not the law, but the perversion of the law that we'll use as a weapon. I want to mention, though, on top of that, this takeover that just occurred of the independent regulatory agencies, because that's what I was in, a federal independent regulatory agency. And let me tell you just super briefly what would have happened if that had occurred under the Reagan administration, because the closest equivalent to Elon Musk was a guy named Charlie Keating. And he had immense political power. And this is what, again, you need to know. A moderate-sized corporation, if you're the CEO, you can loot that corporation. What do you care that you spend $5 million on lobbying and political contributions? It's nothing, and it doesn't come from you. It comes from the corporation which you're running into bankruptcy, but you're getting immensely wealthy as you do it, right? And so Charlie Keating managed to get a majority of the House of Representatives, including the entire leadership of both parties in the House, both parties, the entire leadership, to co-sponsor a resolution calling on us not to, quote unquote, re-regulate the savings and loan industry, which was a super criminogenic environment. Okay, that's one. Two, the administration called on us, and I need to stress, I'm not exaggerating, to run the industry as a Ponzi scheme. They literally, the key Treasury official in charge of savings and loans, officially testifying on behalf of Treasury, said insolvency is irrelevant. And you could simply have them grow to pay their bills by bringing in more deposits. Run a literal Ponzi scheme. Third, Treasury and OMB, Office of Management and Budget, which in that era was the closest thing to the club that the president had, against all the agencies, threatened to make criminal referrals against the head of our agency on the grounds, in scare quotes, that we were closing too many insolvent savings and loans. Think of that. So that we're not supposed to close them. They're supposed to run like Ponzi's. And then on top of that, Charles Keating's lobbying and all these political contributions convinced President Reagan to appoint 2 members. It was a 3 presidential member agency. So that was a majority. directly chosen by Charles Keating, who were literally going to do Charles Keating's bidding. Had any of those things occurred, and all of them would have occurred under this unitary executive theory that they're operating under now, the savings and loan debacle would have been the great financial crisis. It just would have been it 15 years earlier, because there were already 300 savings and loans growing more than 50% a year, and all of them were frauds, and hundreds of new frauds were entering every year from failing real estate developers. The implications of this, yes, the savings and loan debacle was a debacle, but it didn't affect the general economy, according to economists, much at all. Whereas the great financial crisis, the best estimate, this is in present value terms, by a conservative economist, is that it cost us in just the U.S., the international effects were at least as big. Just the U.S. lost GDP, present value, 41.7 trillion, that's with a T, folks, that's $1,000 billion. The consequences of allowing these frauds to go on for 10, 15, 20 years, it's not the same. And growth is exponential, right? So now, with the musts of the world, the billionaires literally in charge, we are looking at, in addition to the destruction of democracy, in addition to the destruction of the rule of law, we are going to look at the biggest looting in the history of the world, and with catastrophic economic consequences.
Paul, I want to turn it to you real quick, because Mark had mentioned La Cosa Nostra, of what you knew intimately with your work down in Miami, but also the Department of Justice. I mean, we've got Pam Bondi, who was obviously a player during the 2008 great financial crisis. I would say that's where she got her ticket to Mar-a-Lago, so to speak, and the mess that everything is coming down the pike right now. Can you comment on DOJ from your perspective?
Well, where do I begin? So last time we met, we
Right.
sort of ended our meeting by saying, let's not talk about the next administration, because if it's Trump, the whole world could be different. And I think we're here. So when Mark talked about corruption at DOJ, which has sort of led to the I don't want to say led to the first financial crisis, but sort of led to the inability to tackle the second financial crisis, the great financial crisis. That to me was corruption, but it was small c corruption. It was corruption based upon political appointees not having the will to fix things, not having the competence to fix things. And we met many times talking about how you could implement ways to fix the Department of Justice so they could investigate that type of crime. Now, that's all gone. As Bill just said, and as Mark said, we are in large C corruption, where the corruption that's taking over the Department of Justice and all the agencies of the government really is about allowing this team to steal money, this team to rob our economy. And there is no attention that's going to be paid to solving the white collar elite crimes, elite economic crimes that are out there today. There's nothing going on in the Department of Justice that is going to allow the Department of Justice to even act in a way, a normal way, which they're going to be prosecuting the routine cases, which they've always been able to do. So people are leaving the Department of Justice in droves. They're getting fired in droves. It's happening across all enforcement agencies. I wish I could predict for you something good that's going to come out of this, but nothing good has come out of this. The fact that the Department of Justice used to be the envy of the law enforcement world. When I would go around the world teaching anti-corruption and things like that, people marveled at the fact that you were from the Department of Justice. And now that the opposite is happening now. So I don't know where this is going, and I'm afraid to even think of where it's going, because I think right now the whole play ought to be, how do you save the republic? And I think that's really where we are.
Okay, well, on that note, I want everybody to understand that the people that you're looking at here know exactly how to fix the problem if they had the critical mass and the ability to get everybody in the right positions to be able to hold us account. I mean, that's exactly what you did at the Department of Justice. It trained people, both of you, quite frankly, Bill and Paul. But I want to turn it over to you, to David Kay, because you're obviously, under the light of everybody who wants to know everything there is to know about Trump. But as we're seeing, parse out in this conversation, what we've heard from Bill and Paul, and also Mark, is decades long of lessons of things that you've been bringing to us, telling us that Donald Trump's been involved with forever. And yet, of course, DAs and prosecutors never took Don down for all the stuff that you've been exposing for decades. Can you give us kind of an overview and then back into what's the most important thing to you at the moment?
Well, Donald is the third generation head of a 4-generation white collar crime family. And now in America, we have these notions that police prowl cars fight crime, which has been shown to be nonsense. It's a huge waste of money. And then secondly, we talk about organized crime families, but it's the organized white collar crime families, and there are a number of them, Donald's just one, who don't break your legs or kill you, but they steal by not keeping promises, lying to you, using contracts, having friends in prosecutors' offices like Rudy Giuliani, who will not go after you or your family, no matter how much evidence there is. And Donald is in his current position with Elon Musk and others in the process of destroying every possible institution which could stand up for integrity and to limit his power. And that's what Donald is after here. Donald is a man who has never had a day of joy or contentment in his life. I refer to his life as a Groundhog Day, the nightmare. He's been trapped in the emotions of a 13-year-old boy for more than 60 years now. And the goal here is to just obliterate any form of opposition. So research universities, we're only going to give you 15% overhead, when the whole system was set up 70 years ago to provide 50% overhead because of all the costs that go with research, like you're doing a medical study, getting rid of the medical waste. That's not part of your grant. It's separate. Just moments ago, the New York Daily News broke the story that Elon Musk has somehow radically slashed the health fund for the 9/11 workers, the people who worked on the pile. There is no shame here about anything. Getting rich is an aspect of this, but it's not the primary motivator. Add another $50 billion to the wealth of the richest man in the world, Elon Musk, and it doesn't have any marginal utility to it. It's the power. And this power includes, we are now becoming an ally of the corrupt regime that rules Russia as a dictatorship. We are signaling to President Xi, another dictator, you can take Taiwan. We're not going to defend it. You can build more artificial islands in the South China Sea and prevent open seas traffic through that area. The signals that we're sending are incredibly clear. They're just as clear as when on his first presidency, Donald Trump stopped his motorcade about 5 blocks from the White House. He and the family got out. They all took a turn on the asphalt. Not one news organization except me at DC Report told people where he stopped, which was in front of the Trump Hotel. But you can be sure that every foreign agent, every lobbyist, every sophisticated person seeking favors from the government got the message. You want something from Donald Trump, you will pay tribute. Now they're being completely open about it. They feel they are invincible. They feel the Democrats will get nowhere. You're beginning to see the courts crumble. Judge Chutkan, who had handled the insurrection case against Trump, just allowed the firings to go forward. Now, you can read her opinion, as I do, as essentially saying to the 16 state attorneys general, bad lawyering. You guys didn't write a proper complaint, so I can't do anything. But she also didn't somehow open it up for a further hearing and signal to them they could amend their complaint. And so I don't see that the courts are necessarily going to be a bulwark to defend our country. And the goal, take down every institution that remains so that there is absolute fealty to Donald, who, by the way, last week called himself dictator. He said, anything he does to save the country violates no law. Yesterday, the White House put out a picture of him with a crown, calling him "Long Live the King." Donald always has wanted to be our dictator. I've been telling people this for almost 10 years. And in the beginning, what did I get back? Oh, that's crazy. You're so far out there. You have no credibility. Here it is. He's declared ourselves our dictator. And was the headline on the top of my former newspaper, the New York Times, Trump claims dictatorial powers? No, it was, oh, what does this mean? It's not clear what's going on here.
Yeah, I'm sure that's a validation that you could certainly live without. Turning it to you, June, you had said in our last dialogue, the revelations that I know that people have got to wrap their minds around as it relates to Doge and this backdoor of Congress to fire thousands of employees illegally, not to mention the funding and everything else. But what you are revealing to us is a long-standing sort of march towards this madness that they got their cues from, that began with your prescient work and understanding all things from corporate America beginning in the 80s, quite frankly. Can you kind of animate, what we're looking at based on what brought us here?
Sure. Well, we wrote a book and we started out looking at the fate of women, and we were going to look at low-wage workers at Walmart and community bankers at Wells Fargo and lawyers at GE. And we didn't think these stories were going to have anything to do with each other. We found out every story was the same story. And it's the story of what Elon Musk is doing at Doge. First, there's this shift that takes place in corporate America starting really in the 80s, accelerating in the 90s. And it's a shift from the CEO as steward, a person charged with responsibility for the long-term health of the company, and responsible to multiple stakeholders, including employees, customers, etc. The shift, Alan Greenspan called it a shift to the CEO as dictator. And he said that approvingly. It is the CEO as exercising a form of personalized power. You will see this literature in the business magazines, the charismatic CEO, the narcissistic CEO. But it is about the power at the top. How did they do it? The first thing Jack Welch did at GE was to fire 25% of the workplace. That's in the early 80s. Then he adopts a high-stakes bonus system. Go back to the 50s, the CEO made 20 times the average worker. At its height, the CEO is making 400 times the average worker in the company. And it's tied to a bonus system and stock options. The CEO's pay is linked to the performance of the company's share price in the stock market. Now, how do you boost share price? Well, what Welch did, and what is now close to universal in corporate America, are bonuses. Often high-stakes bonuses. Whether it's Walmart or GE or any number of other companies, 2/3 of total income could come from the bonus. And for top executives, these are tied to stock options. But the bonuses pit people against each other, making everyone insecure. Then the CEO, and we call it the New Boys Club, reaches down into the ranks or hires from outside the company and picks people who deliberately know nothing. They tend to be young. Jack Welch emphasized confidence to spare. He wanted his new boys to outflank the old boys, who are the defenders of the institutional order, to break through the bureaucracy at GE and get things done immediately, while Jack Welch could look the other way at the methods that were being used to accomplish this. And when you have the system, again, personalized power, a kind of competition that pits everybody against each other and keeps them insecure, picking people who know relatively little. And GE, like Walmart, deliberately rotated its managers every 2 years or so. Why? So they didn't go native. Once they knew something, then they were switched to another area, maybe an entirely different specialty, where they knew nothing except how to produce the numbers Jack Welch wanted. And when you do that, you predict for narcissism, overconfidence bias, amorality. The amorality is built in and baked into the system. And so what do? Well, again, I like to talk about Jack Welch because we have a complete record. We know he lied. The system was designed in part to produce fake numbers. He showed earnings increased by 300 some percent over 20 years, but share price increased by 4,000% because the stock market reacts to earnings reports that may not be accurate. And by the time the stock market figures out the earnings reports are accurate, you may be onto a new CEO in the modern era, or you may be onto a new set of initiatives that further skew the perception of what's taking place. So what does this produce? First, a willingness to lie, baked into the culture. Secondly, an emphasis on the short term at the expense of the long term. What's the first thing Jack Welch did? Get rid of the research labs that had been his secret to advancement at GE. You only invest in things that pay off immediately. You don't care about workers. Loyalty to workers is gone. Get rid of 25%. That's great. Slash costs. Slashing costs by firing workers or getting rid of training programs or research labs gives you immediate impact. You look efficient. You're saving money. You're eliminating fraud. And 5 years from now, when you don't have the payout from those things, well, if you're Jack Welch, you just acquire a new company. It's all smoke and mirrors. We don't know what this has done to productivity. Paul Krugman says the US is the most productive, efficient company in the world. When I talk to economists, they tell me we don't know how to measure productivity. We can't say anything about it. So you have a whole lot of glitz. But you're in the private sector undermining basic research. And now we're going to take these same tactics to the public sector, where people are never motivated there's less fraud in the federal government than there is in most companies. Why? Federal workers are not motivated by bonuses. So that's my story.
Well, yeah, again, it's step and repeat in the blueprint for what we're seeing. And Mark, I've learned so much from you throughout the years, but your ability to execute for the American people is one of the most incredible things I've ever witnessed in my life. And I want to bring it full circle from this perspective. We both know, and you taught me, that going back to maybe the early 2000s, there was literally a hostile takeover of newspapers throughout the country vis-a-vis private equity and hedge funds, first and foremost. So this has been a long, long routine to get us to this point where we just saw recently with Donald's sort of, offensiveness against, the New York Times getting, a settlement from, of course, we saw from Twitter, right? The $10 million from Twitter recently, not to mention what's going on at Paramount and CBS and yada, yada, yada. But when you had your tenure as a attorney general in Ohio, you didn't have a lot of resources to be able to investigate what ultimately became a racketeering construct that we know the FBI was looking into and didn't deliver for the American people. You had the ability to do the investigation through the discovery, to get the indictments, to then carry through a racketeering conviction to hold this type of corruption to account. Now, in the meantime, in the last 5 or so years, you've been deeply involved with all sorts of fraud in the state of Ohio that includes I think it was First Energy that was involved with all sorts of, pay to play schemes. But I think that Summit County, Ohio, had to mirror what you did back during the in the aftermath of the great financial crisis. That they were able to get convictions now, which is really intriguing.
And they got indictments, which is a step. No convictions yet.
They didn't get convictions. I thought they got indicted, but they built it upon what you guys were doing. Okay, but that says a lot anyway. So can you kind of marry the failure of media, let's say it being, hedged by literally hedge funds, right? So you can't get the discovery to the American people at the same time where people within the institutions of government meant to uphold the law, then of course can't carry through what the law is in face of this overwhelming corruption. What are your thoughts towards that?
Well, I mean, Ohio's been a kind of a microcosm of a kleptocracy for the last 25 years in government and politics. And the First Energy scandal, where we're still paying, by the way, an additional subsidy for a coal plant in Indiana that doesn't produce any coal for Ohioans and electric generation as a result of that bill that was passed. So even the bill that was passed and for which the elected officials were convicted of corruptly accepting bribes in exchange for the passage of the bill, they still haven't been able. First Energy is still so powerful in the state that they haven't been able to repeal the extra tax they put on people to pay to pay. So we've been dealing with this forever. Here on a smaller scale, it's easier and it's less threatening to the world into the country. By the way, those hedge funds are primarily funded or significantly funded by public pension fund investments. So they're taking and I assume private pension fund investments as well. So they're taking the hard-earned retirement savings of the people that are about to get screwed and using it to fund this takeover of the media and literally driving most newspapers in this country that operate on a for-profit basis out of business, and to further reduce the scrutiny on what's going on in their in their worlds. And so that's a smaller set of oligarchs that are operating kind of at the state level because they want to protect their pension fund investments. They want to protect the things that will keep the money flowing into their pocket. So, but here, and to his credit, Dave Yost, who is the current AG, who's not, I didn't vote for, but he when the feds failed to indict the executives, before the statute of limitations ran, he came in and did it. He engaged and he did exactly what we did in 2007, 2008. He put together a team of the Summit County Prosecutor's Office, investigators from various state and county agencies around the state, put a task force together to do the investigation that the FBI had already done, by the way, and then use that as a basis for those indictments, and so it was that did work at that level. So and he's an elected office holder, so there's some accountability there, but. For the larger picture, I don't know what to tell you. This is so much worse. What we've seen over the last four weeks is so much worse than any. I woke up I don't know if I was dreaming it or I woke up from a dream thinking it, but if I could wave a magic wand, I'd like to interview the folks in the Weimar Republic to find out what they thought, what they wish they had done differently during the rise of the Nazi takeover, because so many of the earmarks of what happened there, the takeover of the kleptocrats takeover of the media, these guys and David, your Trump expertise is so fascinating to me on this issue as well. Hitler threw all those oligarchs under the bus once he consolidated his power. And as satisfying as that sounds right now, that's also extremely scary. Well, and I think that's just the kind of guy that Donald Trump is.
Yeah, the industrialists back in 1933 to 39 hedged wrong. And yeah, boy, but we don't learn lessons, do we? Because again, that's the whole undercurrent of fascism. But I want to turn this just briefly because, boy, everybody could chime in at this point, obviously. But I got to ask you this question to Paul. Look, Paul, by the way, is a celebrity of his own right. Now, in a more funny time, he had a cameo in one of my greatest films of all time, Kingpin, where he accidentally stuffed Woody Harrelson down the bowling pin. But beyond that, you were also a featured interviewee with Alex Gibney's work, The Crime of the Century, because of all things, the Sacklers, right? And I remember when I first interviewed you for The Con, I had asked you where the Department of Justice was, and you said you guys were deeply involved with control fraud. And I was like, control fraud? I just learned this from Bill Black, that's the entirety of our financial system, i.e., what was spawning from the real estate bubble and crash. And you were like, no, we were dealing with healthcare control fraud in Florida because of Tim Scott, who I just saw right before I hit play on this, is basically consulting on Doge of all things. Paul, I mean, this is like Mark said and everybody else said, this is maybe a new level of the insanity. You guys have been in the belly of the beast for like decades.
Yeah, it wasn't Tim Scott, remember? It was the former head of Senator Scott from Florida.
Rick Scott.
Oh, Rick Scott. Yeah. Oh, that's
Yeah.
sorry.
Yeah, who ended up taking the fifth about 45 times. But now we have a director of the FBI who took the fifth. Look, I want to cry. I mean, the notion that you have a functioning system at the Department of Justice or any regulatory agency that can now handle any type of control fraud is simply out the window. This is new territory. It ain't going to be happening. It's not going to be happening. And as it relates to all of the crimes that we tackled at the fraud section of the Department of Justice, FCPA, which was the greatest leveler for American business that ever happened. It actually leveled the playing field for American business by allowing us to stop international bribery and corruption all over the world. And now if you take that out of the mix, the big companies are still going to operate legitimately because they're not going to want to report to the public that they're paying bribes. But it's the new entrants to the market, the new entrants to the system, many of them who are up Trump's ass now, who are going to feel very comfortable paying bribes now that they know that there isn't going to be any enforcement in that regard. Look, it's going to be every day for the next at least 2 years or maybe 4 years is going to be worse than the day before, unless someone puts a stop to this. And I don't know how that's going to happen.
Can anybody remember ever when the Justice Department announced that they weren't going to be enforcing a particular law, as they did with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act? I can't. I mean, I can't remember any time like that. But many of you were following this much closer than I was.
I'm going to mix metaphors here, David, in terms of, it feels like I'm looking at this group of the untouchables and you guys are like, Superman with kryptonite, or quite frankly, it's Gotham. And these guys are the good guys with the bat signal that can't be seen, right? And so, David, all of the elements of what's going on, but on top of the added dimension of all things Donald, I find myself at a loss, but at the same time, I also know that we have the tools and the expertise and the professionals to do this. What we're missing is the American public because of what you've said. The media doesn't know how to tell these stories.
Well, let's be clear. It's not just the news organizations. We had a series of policies that I wrote about in my best-selling trilogy on the economy, Perfectly Legal, Free Lunch, The Fine Print, that redistributed money upwards in these very stealthy ways that I spent forever digging into the most boring, hard to read, arcane statutes and rules. And the Rand Corporation ultimately concluded that $50 trillion was transferred up through these subtle mechanisms that are almost all still on the books. There are very few exceptions about what's been done. What we're going to see going forward here is there will be prosecutions by the Justice Department, but they will only be of people who are perceived enemies of Donald or Elon or someone where Donald wants to hurt people. There will be tax audits. So right now they are reassigning. This hasn't made the news anywhere, by the way. They are reassigning IRS criminal agents to work on the border with Mexico. Not, help arrest people down there because they're trained law enforcement officers who can carry a weapon. They are going to have audits, but the audits are not going to be the people who need them, like Donald and Elon Musk. They're going to use the government to go after Donald's enemies to suppress. And, you guys are somewhat hopeful that in 2 or 4 years something will change. I'm not nearly so sanguine. And listen, I have 8 children. Anybody in this era who has 8 children is an incurable optimist. But once you've got the levers of power, there's only one thing left Donald has to do to have absolute power. And that is replacing generals and admirals and promoting out of order junior officers who are loyal to Donald, who disrespect the fact that officers, unlike grunts, only take an oath to the Constitution. Grunts take one to follow the president and obey the Constitution. But there are always junior officers in everywhere in the world who, for vainglorious and other reasons, will sell out their country. And they've hinted now that they're starting to decide through Pete Hegseth which generals and admirals they're going to jettison, and it certainly will not be the ones who are the best. So once they have control of the military, and Donald has said he wants to use the military against the American people, I think we're in for much, much deeper trouble. And at the same time, we're aligning ourselves with dictators around the world. So the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which was talked about earlier, which has had tremendous beneficial effects. Of course, they're going to throw that out because they don't want anything that would interfere with, we're going to do whatever we want to do. And the concept of the rule of law is, we all understand it. The people in this audience probably do. Stop a random person at the grocery store and ask them, what does that mean, the rule of law? And the best you're likely to get is a superficial answer. There's no sophisticated understanding of this. And compounding this are the severe decline in reading skills. Half of American adults read at the level of a 6th grader or below. 1 in 5 reads at the level of a 3rd grader, an 8-year-old. Those are functionally illiterate. People are functionally innumerate in this country. They don't grasp large numbers. They're meaningless to them, and they don't think about public policy. And you're going to see a big drive to get more and more people to pay less attention to politics and more to things that are fun but don't matter, like sports. So I'm not so sanguine about this. The one thing I believe would change this is if in their lust for power and greed, they start doing things that hurt poor Republicans. I mean, they did this great changeover where working class people now think the Republicans are their friends. And that's because, as Donald loves to say, they're poorly educated. They don't know they're being hurt. If they're dumb enough to repeal the Affordable Care Act, that will hurt them a lot. They're suggesting big cuts to Medicaid. More people benefit from the Affordable Care Act and Medicaid in red states than blue. But if they listen, frankly, to Steve Bannon, whose advice is about where to target their efforts, their strength will grow, not weaken.
I know you have to go, David, but I heard you say courageously recently in an interview that if Donald has an enemies list, you're going to be up towards the top of it, and yet that would not dissuade you from telling the truth every chance you get. So thank you for that, all you do. And I want to turn that question over to you, Bill, because courage really is what needs to manifest above all else. So, given kind of the scope of this dialogue, and let's take us home, Bill, and close us up in terms of what you've heard here and what you think we need to hear moving forward.
Okay, so let's put it together from a criminologist perspective of how we look at these things, which, as everybody has said, have occurred throughout history in many places, right? So what does this mean to have control fraud? It means that it's typically a guy controlling a seemingly legitimate corporation or government entity, uses it as camouflage, a weapon, and a shield to steal and become very wealthy, powerful, with near impunity. So how are you going to do that? Well, of course, the anti-corruption acts that we've talked about are effective. That's why they have to go, right? So this efficiency commission, DOGE, is to look for efficiency and kill it, right? Because that last thing they want is government efficiency and government honesty. As Paul pointed out, the United States is the envy of the world of democratic forces that want a rule of law, right? So we've both done these international discussions. Mark may well have done them as well. And it's absolutely true. People want, I mean, they're thrilled to have a senior person come from the United States and explain this is how we actually put powerful people in prison who are criminals, right? And by the way, USAID was one of the leading entities that did these anti-corruption efforts throughout the world, which is why it has to go, right? But to add to the pessimism of David, they have not begun the massive grifts. The massive grifts are using the U.S. Treasury and the Federal Reserve to make the crypto bros the wealthiest people in the world. And the brazenness is just staggering. We're going to create a sovereign wealth fund and we're going to buy massive amounts of crypto. What will that do to the price of crypto? And since there's no intrinsic value to the crypto, it's all momentum in jargon and finance. Well, how do you create momentum? You get control of a sovereign wealth fund. And these sovereign wealth funds, with the exception of Norway, are notoriously corrupt throughout the world. Witness the son-in-law of the President of the United States.
Right.
Witness in the savings and loan debacle, the Kuwaiti version that was in league with Charles Keating on the fraud schemes. Also, the RICO we talked about. RICO is going to be gone, or at least our ability to use RICO against elite white-collar criminals. Now, first, it was almost repealed. And I mean, everybody came together. The bar associations came together, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this is in the 80s, the late 80s, early 90s type stuff. And they created a super coalition. It was greased to go through the federal legislature. And then we got well over, 1,700 convictions of elite folks and brought all these fraud actions. And suddenly the legislator got embarrassed. But that's going to be gone. Whether by another executive order saying we're not going to use RICO anymore against elite white-collar criminals, or only with special permission, in other words, to go against our opponents, RICO will cease being a force for good, and it will be used only, if it's kept at all, it'll be used as a weapon against the opponents. Right? And the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, they want corruption. And you can tell that because whatever they're doing, in truth, is what they accuse everyone else of doing. So Trump and Musk are repeating the word corruption like 12 times a day, each of them, about what they're supposedly doing. Now, again, I'll leave you with this. I was the guy dealing with the press in the savings and loan debacle. And we would make these charges. And then the press would say, well, what do you have to sustain it? And I would have a detailed complaint. And I would take them through paragraph by paragraph, what we had found, what that meant, why that was not only a civil wrong, but a felony, or multiple felonies typically, right? DOGE can pick the best people in the world, of their crazies, right? and put that person in front of a camera and walk us through with the actual documents showing what they found in the way of corruption. And you know what they've got? Bupkis. Absolutely nothing that they've been able to do. All of their charges on corruption have been lies, massively inflated lies, because leave what on top of everything else, when you recruit people who have to lie, you cannot be an official recruited into this administration unless you are willing to lie for the dear leader. Well, you can get some people who are pretty good, but overwhelmingly the people who are really good will not go into that in a place like America. Maybe 2 generations now they will. So these people are, the formal word is kakistocracy, is the rule by the worst of us morally. Look at Elon Musk's record on technology. Look at the Hyperloop. Go online about what he said and how he doesn't understand the most basic concepts of engineering or physics, right? Again, I'll leave you with this word, audacity. It ain't genius. It's simple audacity and the willingness to use power. And sorry, one final thing. It will lead to violence. It'll lead to violence because they're going to get the mob to attack people. They're already doing that. It'll lead to violence because they're passing laws, for example, that you can, with near impunity, run over protesters with your car. And because Trump last term wanted the protesters shot. Protesters will be in the street, and there's every reason to believe that Trump will give the orders to have people shot.
Well, I learned decades ago that the formula that Trump emulates is to lie, deny, switch the blame, and implicate is the start. And the other side of this that I learned from all of my lessons from you guys and what I've seen through the lens of history is corruption births and fuels fascism, to your point. And look, if they got away with the insurrection and they got away with the Supreme Court basically qualifying Trump as presidential immunity, and maybe there was voter suppression. I've seen this work by Greg Palast, about 3.5 million minority votes suppressed in the last election, and so on and so forth. How could we expect, given the power that Trump has at the moment, that we'll ever see fair elections again with integrity? I guess I don't know if I want an answer. I mean, I think it's a rhetorical question. Go ahead.
Yeah. I'd like to just note a historical precedent. This isn't new. We had the robber barons and the titans of finance take over and corrupt America the last time there was a far-reaching economic change. How did it end? 2 world wars and the Great Depression. And that created the space for New Deal reforms, not just to take hold then, but to stay in place. Trump will crash and burn. The question is, and let's hope it's the economy and not a world war. When he does, what happens next? He's already laying the predicate for discrediting prosecutions of the people who caused the next financial crisis, not just cutting the agencies, but anything we do to go after Trump and Musk will be characterized as politically motivated. I think laying the groundwork for what happens after Trumpism crashes and burns, which it will, is a critical agenda item.
Mark or Dan, any closing thoughts?
No, I enjoyed the conversation. I look forward to maybe in 100 of these we can come up with some solutions.
Yeah, I would just like to say to you guys, I want to do these as often as you're willing to do them, because somebody has to hear out there the voices that they're not hearing you guys. You're not welcomed, or at least yet, unless we can get you there. by the way, I will close with this. I am feeding this to a lot of other podcasters that have much bigger audiences that are going. They already invited June and Bill on, and hopefully get you guys going as a group. So hopefully there'll be some upside from that point. Think of me as the minor leagues, even though I've got more knowledge than any of those guys up the food chain, thanks to you guys. But we'll do everything we can that you're willing to do. So I really appreciate your time and everything. And on that note, I'll say thank you guys for joining us, and until next time, all the best.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nice seeing you guys.